He punched through the boundary between one universe and this one, and the universe he arrived in has never once run out of reasons to fight. The air here tastes of rust and incense and the slow death of suns. Every prayer is a weapon, every silence is the breath before another war begins. In Warhammer 40,000, power is not a gift. It is a throne, and everything alive is trying to take it from you. So what does the strongest man in existence do in a galaxy that has been waiting 10,000 years for something it cannot break? The void between the dead stars of the Harroglass cluster had not changed in 11,000 years. No life grew there, no shipping lanes threaded between those burnt-out suns. The Imperium had catalogued the region in the 32nd millennium, confirmed the absence of exploitable resources, filed the data, and forgotten it. The dead stars turned slowly in the dark, shedding pale, cold light on nothing, and nothing answered. Castrum Viridis was not supposed to be beautiful. It was a transit station, a bureaucratic necessity, a fuel depot for warp-capable vessels cutting through the segmentum obscurus on long hauls toward the spinward frontier. Its architecture was functional and grim, a central hub of reinforced ferrocrete and void-hardened steel, bristling with fuel lines and docking arms and sensor arrays, surrounded by the dull amber glow of its shield generators. The station had been built 200 years ago, expanded 40 years after that, and had suffered a minor demon incursion 30 years prior that the resident Mechanicus contingent had quietly suppressed before inquisitorial observers could arrive and demand answers. It was, by the standards of the 41st millennium, entirely ordinary. Magos Vethran Korath had commanded the station's Mechanicus contingent for 11 years. He was old in the way that Mechanicus adepts became old, which is to say that very little of him remained biological. His lower torso had been replaced by a wheeled locomotion chassis that moved silently across the station's grating. His arms had been augmented 3 times, the most recent replacement incorporating micro-manipulator clusters that could work at tolerances of 1/100th of a millimeter. His eyes were high-resolution optical augments that registered data in 17 spectra simultaneously. Of his original biological mass, approximately 31% remained, centered in his skull and the upper thorax, housing what the Mechanicus diplomatically termed his organic cognition core. He found this percentage satisfying. The fewer compromises he made to biological necessity, the more clearly he could think. He was thinking very clearly at 0344 station time when his secondary alert array registered an anomaly on the hull. Not a threat, precisely, not initially. The external sensors, redundant, overlapping, hardened against electromagnetic interference, blessed thrice yearly by a sub-magos whose function was specifically to maintain the sanctity of the machine spirits within, registered a mass of approximately 73 kilograms resting on the hull of Docking Arm 4 in the section between the fuel transfer manifold and the emergency airlock cluster. The mass was not debris because it was moving. It was not a maintenance servitor because it was not transmitting the correct transponder codes. It was not a void-suited crew member because the station manifest showed no repair orders scheduled for that section at this time. It was a biologic, standing on the outer hull of a void station with no atmosphere, no thermal protection, and no visible suit. Korath processed this for exactly 4 seconds, which was a long time for him. Then he activated every sensor array on the station simultaneously and turned them all toward Docking Arm 4. The figure was a man, male, biologic, average height, build unremarkable. He wore a white bodysuit with no visible thermal regulation, no pressure containment, no oxygen supply. A short yellow cape moved in absolutely no wind, which was technically correct for a vacuum but aesthetically strange. He had no helmet. He appeared to be breathing, which was impossible, or he appeared not to be breathing, which was fine, except that the bio-monitors detected a heartbeat. The man was standing on the hull and looking at the dead stars, not moving, not signaling, not attempting to breach the station, simply standing there in the hard vacuum, looking at the stars with an expression that Korath's optical augments, even at maximum resolution, read as something close to boredom. Korath activated the weapon servitors, 8 of them, covering all visible angles on docking arm 4, plasma weapons and las cutters spinning to operational readiness, with the sound of obedient machines waking from rest. He activated the Vox array pointed at the hull section, then switched to infrared pulse communication, strobing the section in a language any Imperial vessel would recognize as an identification demand. The man on the hull turned his head. He had seen the strobing. He looked at it for a moment, with the same expression he had been wearing while examining the stars. Mild, faintly curious, not alarmed. Then he reached out and knocked on the hull with his knuckles. 3 precise impacts, polite in their cadence, the vibration transmitting through the hull plating into the station's skeleton and into every sensor array Korath had trained on that section. Veteran Korath processed the knock for 2 seconds. Then he opened the emergency airlock. The man stepped inside without hesitation, without suit pressurization, without any apparent concern about transitioning from vacuum to pressurized atmosphere. The inner door cycled, the decontamination spray activated. He stood in the decontamination chamber looking around at the walls with mild interest, rubbing one eye with the back of his wrist. When the inner door opened, 8 weapon servitors were waiting, guns raised. Korath stood in his wheeled chassis behind them, 4 acolytes flanking him, his full bioscan array focused on this single figure. The man in the white suit looked at the weapon servitors. He looked at Korath. He looked at the weapon servitors again. "Is there food?" he said. "I have not eaten in a while." Korath scanned him for 37 seconds while the man waited patiently. Every reading was wrong, not in the way that malfunction produced wrong readings, where values simply failed to register or returned null data. These readings returned values, clear, precise, definitively measured values. It was the values themselves that were wrong. The bone density, the muscle fiber engagement potential, the metabolic output, the structural stress tolerances of the biological material. He had spent 60 years cataloging anomalous phenomena. He had cataloged warp-touched organisms, xenos of 8 distinct genetic phyla, servitors modified beyond the specifications of any standard template construct, and one object of genuinely unknown origin that he had spent 14 years analyzing before reluctantly classifying as archaeotech of the Dark Age. He updated his threat classification to extreme priority and simultaneously began preparing a full hospitality protocol. Because in 60 years, he had also learned that the most dangerous things he had encountered were the ones that did not know they were dangerous. "The station has commissary facilities," he said carefully. "Follow the servitors. Please do not touch anything." The man in the white suit nodded and followed the servitors. He did not ask what the servitors were. He did not ask where he was. He did not ask how he had arrived, or why 8 guns had been pointed at him the moment he entered. He simply walked down the corridor, hands in his pockets, and looked at the walls. Korath followed at a careful distance, running calculations. His name, as best as Korath could transcribe it from the man's limited but functional Gothic approximation speech patterns, was Saitama. He had learned Gothic, he explained, the same way he had apparently learned everything, which was by encountering it and absorbing it. He could not explain this process further. He seemed mildly embarrassed when pressed. He ate an extraordinary amount. The station commissary had been stocked for a complement of 412 personnel. Saitama consumed approximately 3 days of rations for a full Astra Militarum squad, steadily and without apparent enjoyment, in about 20 minutes. He thanked the servitor that brought the trays. The servitor, which had no cognitive apparatus for processing gratitude, returned to its charging station. Korath observed from across the commissary, seated in his chassis with his acolytes around him, his full scan array running continuously. Every piece of data confirmed the impossibility. This was not a demon wearing a biological shell. He had catalogued demons. They registered in the warp, leaked psychic energy, destabilized local reality in ways his instruments detected. This man had no warp presence whatsoever, less than 0. The section of the commissary around him registered a faint but measurable psychic null zone, the kind of effect Korath associated with pariah genetics or certain nullifying archaeotech. This was not a servitor. The cognition patterns were too irregular, too genuinely responsive. This was not a custodian. He had encountered custodians twice in his career. They registered differently, and more importantly, they did not eat like this. This was, as best as Korath could determine, precisely what he appeared to be, a human male, young by the biological markers, unremarkable in almost every visible characteristic, with physical parameters that made no structural sense within any biological framework he had ever encountered. No visible augmentation, no implanted weaponry, no armor, and no apparent awareness of how dangerous his own existence was. The Magos pulled up his oldest equation set, the one he had written 60 years ago as a young acolyte full of the Omnissiah's certainty, before the anomalies had taught him to be careful. The one that began, all things that exist for a function. He stared at the man across the commissary. You said you were looking at the stars, Korath said. What were you looking for? Saitama looked up from his food. An enemy, he said. The word landed in the commissary with a weight that silenced even the ambient noise of the recycling fans and the distant thrum of the fuel transfer systems. Korath processed the statement. You are searching for combat. Not exactly, Saitama said. He set down the empty tray and picked up the next one. I am searching for something that can make combat feel like combat again. He paused. It is hard to explain. Have you ever gotten so good at something that doing it does not feel like anything anymore? Korath thought about this. In principle, he understood it. In practice, he had never achieved mastery sufficient to produce that state. There was always more to learn, more data to process, more precision to gain. The Omnissiah's knowledge was infinite. There was no ceiling against which to flatten. No, he said, honestly. It is not great, Saitama said, and ate. The silence between them was not hostile. Korath found it instructive. Most threats he had encountered were aggressive about their threat nature. They postured, they announced, they made their danger visible as a warning or a boast. This man was making no such announcement. He was simply explaining a problem he had, in the same register he might have used to describe a malfunctioning piece of household equipment. Korath began to understand that the man did not know what he was, not in the sense of ignorance about his nature. Saitama, it became clear over the next 4 hours, understood perfectly well that he was very strong, that nothing had been able to hurt him in a very long time, that he could move at speeds that could not be measured by the instruments he had grown up around. He understood these things the way a person understood that they were tall or had brown eyes, as facts about themselves that had stopped being remarkable through sheer familiarity. What he did not understand was what those facts meant in context. He had no framework for the 41st millennium, no knowledge of the Imperium, the Chaos Gods, the Tyrannid hive fleets, the Orcs, the Eldari, or any of the forces that had been grinding each other and humanity to dust across 10,000 years of endless war. He had emerged from a universe with a different set of rules and arrived in this one, as he put it, by accident, while mid-punch. Mid-punch, Korath said. I hit something, Saitama said. It took me a while to stop. Korath updated his files. He flagged them with the highest priority classification available to him, reserved typically for events of galactic consequence, and composed a tight beam message to the nearest Mechanicus Forge world, 3 warp jumps distant. He composed it carefully because he was not certain he believed what he was about to transmit, and he needed to word it in a way that would not result in his credentials being revoked. He did not transmit it yet. Because in 60 years of cataloging anomalies, he had learned that the interval between discovery and announcement was often the most valuable period of data gathering, and he had not gathered nearly enough data. You said you were searching for an enemy, Korath said. In my experience, enemies in this galaxy are not difficult to find. I have been here maybe a week, Saitama said. He had finished the last tray. He was looking at the empty table, with the expression of a man who has eaten a great deal and is not sure whether he is actually satisfied. I have not found anything yet that would be worth the trip. Korath looked at his readings. The biometrics had stabilized, the output projections had not. He had spent 4 hours refining his calculations, consulting the most sophisticated analytical frameworks the Mechanicus had developed over 10,000 years of data gathering, and the number they kept returning to was the same. Effectively unbounded. He understood. sitting in his chassis in the commissary of a transit station in the middle of nowhere, that what had knocked on his hull was possibly the most dangerous entity the 41st millennium had ever seen. Not because it wanted to hurt anyone, because it wanted someone to try. And the 41st millennium was very, very good at providing enemies. The Orcs did not use standard communication frequencies. This was both a tactical reality and an evolutionary one. The Orcoid species had developed, over millions of years, a psychic network that they were only dimly aware of, a field of collective potential they called the Wa, that transmitted information through a biological channel with nothing to do with Vox systems or astropathic relay. When Orcs gathered in sufficient numbers and sufficient excitement, the Wa field became self-sustaining, spreading outward through the warp in pulses that other Orcs felt as distant pressure, as the urge to move, as the primal conviction that there was something very large and very good to fight in that direction. The first Orc freebooter crew to detect Castrum Viridis had done so 2 years prior to Saitama's arrival. They had examined the station, calculated the weapon complement against their own firepower, determined the odds favored the station, and made the practical decision to move on to softer targets. This was not cowardice by Orc standards. This was sensible target selection, but they had talked about the station. In Orc society, talking about a target created a kind of social energy around it. The freebooters told other Orcs about the transit station in the Harroglass cluster, not because they thought anyone should attack it, but because talking about potential fights was a primary social bonding activity for the species. Other Orcs in the region added their own assessments. None of this was significant, individually. What was significant was the pulse that moved through the Warg field in the region roughly 9 days after Saitama arrived at Castrum Viridis. It was not a transmission in any language. It was a feeling, traveling through the psychic network of 1,000 Orc minds spread across a dozen systems, arriving in all of them as the same simple, overwhelming impression. There is something there that is very good to fight. The Orcs who received this impression did not ask where it came from. They felt it the way they felt hunger, the way they felt the pull of a Warg in motion. The precise origin was irrelevant. The content was entirely clear. Very good to fight. Very, very good to fight. So good it makes your teeth ache to think about it. In the system of Skoruk's Rest, 3 months warp transit from the Harroglass cluster, a war boss named Goruk Skullsplit sat on a throne of welded vehicle frames and listened to the pulse with his eyes closed. Goruk Skullsplit was large. This was the first thing any observer noted about him, and the last thing most observers were able to note before ceasing to observe. An ordinary Orc war boss was enormous by any standard. Goruk had gone beyond this baseline substantially. He stood in his throne room at nearly 5 meters, his shoulders wide as a cargo shuttle's loading ramp, his arms ending in fists the approximate size and density of wrecking balls. His skull had been reinforced with iron plates bolted directly into the bone by a pain boy whose surgical discretion was legendary, and whose continued operation of all 4 limbs was entirely contingent on the war boss's satisfaction with his work. He had been growing his Wa for 32 years. It had begun with 50 Orcs in a broken-down warband on a dead moon. It had expanded through conquest, through reputation, through the simple reality that word spreads in the Wa field about a war boss who keeps finding bigger fights and keeps winning them. Goruk Skullsplit had 2,000 ships now. He had 3 million Orcs under his banner, more flooding in every month as the Wa grew and the psychic field strengthened, and more Orcs in more systems felt the pull and loaded into whatever transport they could find, and aimed it roughly toward the right direction. He had been looking for something worthy. He had fought Imperial Astra Militarum regiments, dug into fortress worlds, and torn the fortresses apart with his hands. He had fought Space Marines and taken wounds from them and healed and fought again. He had fought a Drukhari raiding party and sent the survivors back without their ships. He had fought a Necron phalanx that had reanimated no matter how many times he killed it, and he had eventually destroyed the Tomb World from orbit, which he considered one of the better decisions of his career. He had fought and won, and his Wa had grown, and the fighting had been very good. And yet, every time he won, the fight ended. Every time he crushed something, it stayed crushed. There was a limit to how much punishment everything he had fought could absorb, and that limit had never once pushed back against him in a way that made him feel the edge of himself. The outer boundary where Gorok's skullsplit became insufficient. He wanted to find it. He wanted to hit that edge with everything he had and discover whether he could break through it or whether it was going to break him. The pulse moved through him like a physical thing. He opened his eyes. "There is something," he said, to the room in general. His nobs, the 11 elite veterans who had survived longest in his service, and who were therefore either very loyal or very lucky, straightened from their various postures of casual menace. "Something in that direction," Gorok said. He pointed, and in the way of Warg's field direction, he pointed correctly, the psychic impression in his biology translating dimensional pull into a physical gesture. "What is it?" said his head nob, a scarred veteran named Krug, whose left eye had been replaced with a scope from a Predator tank. Gorok's skullsplit thought about this. He considered the pulse. He considered the feeling it produced, which was different from the feeling he got when he sensed a big herd of enemies or a well-defended planet. Those things felt like meals. This felt like something else. "Something that hits back proper," he said. He stood. The floor under his feet groaned. "Get the fleet moving," he said. "Tell the lads we found a good fight." The War field surged. 3 million orcs in 12 systems felt it at the same moment. The big one has started moving. The good fight is happening. There was a noise, distributed across those 12 systems through the medium of biological psychic resonance, and also through perfectly ordinary orc shouting, that could be roughly translated as collective agreement that this was the correct development. The orc fleet began to move. Saitama had been given quarters on Deck 3. He had not asked for them, but Korath had found that having the man sleeping in the commissary was disruptive to the station's operational rhythms, and also that watching him sleep on the commissary table with his cape folded under his head was producing an effect in his organic cognition core that his diagnostic systems could only classify as unease. The quarters were adequate. Saitama had looked at them, said they were fine, and went to sleep. He slept for 12 hours, which Korath's biomonitors reported was an entirely normal biological recovery period, and then he woke up and asked for more food and spent the afternoon walking around the station and looking at things. He looked at things the way Korath imagined a person might look at an unfamiliar city: mild curiosity, steady engagement with whatever was immediately in front of him, no apparent anxiety about being somewhere unfamiliar or surrounded by creatures he had never encountered. He looked at the weapons servitors and asked what they were. Korath explained, in terms simple enough to be intelligible to someone with no prior exposure to Mechanicus doctrine, that they were human beings who had been modified to serve specialized combat functions, their higher cognition replaced with machine systems, their biological components preserved only to the degree necessary for the combat role. Saitama processed this. "They were people before," he said. "Yes," Korath said. Saitama looked at the weapons servitor for a moment longer, then he moved on and did not comment further, though the biomonitors registered a slight increase in his baseline metabolic rate that Korath had come to associate with suppressed reaction. He looked at the fuel transfer systems and showed genuine interest in the engineering. He asked questions about how the Void Station maintained structural integrity in the gravitational environment of the dead star cluster that showed a surprisingly fluent mechanical intuition. He noticed that one of the secondary fuel manifolds was vibrating at an irregular frequency and mentioned this to Korath, who confirmed on inspection that the manifold was developing a microfracture his teams had not yet detected. He did not take credit for this. He simply moved on. In the evenings, he returned to the hull. Korath watched this on his sensors. The man stepped into the emergency airlock, waited for it to cycle, and stepped out into the vacuum, and stood there on the hull for hours, looking at the stars. The biomonitors read him as stable. His heart rate dropped to a meditative baseline. On the third evening, Korath took the airlock out himself. He had not done this often. His chassis was not designed for vacuum operation, and the experience of standing in the dark with nothing between him and the dead universe had never particularly appealed to him. But something about the image of the man standing out there alone every night, looking at stars that had nothing to offer him, required company. He stood beside Saitama on the hull. The dead stars provided very little illumination. "You come out here every night," Korath said through his external vox. "I like quiet," Saitama said. "It is very quiet inside." "Too quiet in there," Saitama said. He paused. "I know that does not make sense." Korath thought about the distinction. Inside the station, the quiet was machinery, the quiet of servitors and systems operating at their prescribed tolerances, every sound accounted for. Out here, the quiet was genuine absence. "You are accustomed to being somewhere busy," Korath said. "I used to live in a city," Saitama said. He did not elaborate. "The place you came from," Korath said. "You punched through the boundary between your universe and this one, apparently. And in your universe, what were you?" Saitama thought about this. "A hero," he said, and the word came out flat, the way a word comes out when it has been used so many times that the meaning has worn smooth. "You saved people," Korath said. "Yes." "And defeated enemies." "Yes." "And was there no satisfaction in this?" Saitama looked at the dead stars. "At first," he said, "when I was getting strong, when I trained until I could not move and pushed through and got a little stronger, there was something there. And then one day, I was strong enough, and after that," he stopped. "After that nothing hurt. Nothing was hard, and the fights just stopped being fights." Korath processed this. In 60 years he had encountered no theological or philosophical framework that prepared him for the problem this man was describing. The Omnissiah's path was endless accumulation. The ecclesiarchy's teachings were about faith tested by suffering. The warrior traditions of the Astartes were about brotherhood and purpose. None of them had a good answer for what happened to a warrior on the other side of absolute victory. "In this galaxy," Korath said slowly, choosing his words with the care he would give a particularly sensitive calibration, "power is worshipped. Absolutely. Everything that has ever achieved dominance here has been treated as divine or near divine. The orcs have gods made of violence. The Imperium has an emperor who is literally worshipped as the master of mankind. Everything that is strong is treated as sacred." "Okay," Saitama said. "I am telling you this," Korath said, "because what I have measured in you in the past 3 days suggests that you are the most powerful biological entity I have encountered in my career, and I have encountered things that most Imperial citizens would describe as gods, and I want to know if that knowledge changes anything for you." Saitama turned and looked at Korath. His expression was the same one he always wore, mild, a little tired, not unkind. "No," he said. "Does it change things for you?" Korath sat with the question in the vacuum for a moment. "It makes me want to understand you more," he said, honestly. "Then we have something in common," Saitama said. "I want to understand this place." He turned back to the stars. "I can tell something is coming." Korath checked his senses. Everything was nominal. Deep space read as empty. "The Warg field," he said quietly, half to himself, running a calculation. He had calibrated sensors for psychic phenomena as part of his general anomaly detection work. Something was there, distant and directional, like a pressure building at the edge of a weather system. "It is not here yet," Korath said, "but something is coming." "Yes, good," Saitama said. His voice was not excited. It was something quieter than excitement and more durable, the voice of a man who has made a very long journey and can finally smell the destination. The War field reached Castrum Viridis as a sensation before it arrived as a fleet. 3 days before any orc vessel appeared on the long-range augers, Korath's psych-sensitive instruments registered the build-up, a pressure in the local warp fabric, rough and energetic and utterly lacking in subtlety, the psychic equivalent of a very large boot being placed very firmly on the floor somewhere above. His astropath, a thin and perpetually frightened young man named Orvath, who had been stationed at Castrum Viridis as punishment for an administrative error he refused to discuss, woke screaming from a prophetic dream in which he described a green tide and the sound of laughing and everything being very loud and then silence. Korath gave Orvath a sedative and sent the tight beam message to the Forge world. This time he transmitted it without hesitation. Saitama, when informed that something large and violent was approaching, put on his cape. The first Orc vessels were not the Warg proper, they were advanced scouts, 3 freebooter ships whose captains had felt the pull and arrived early, either through warp luck or through being closer than the main fleet when Gorok started moving. They were kill cruisers, large enough to mount significant firepower and small enough to move fast, and they came out of warp transit in close formation and immediately began scanning the station. The station's defense batteries fired first. 4 turrets mounted on the station's upper axis delivered overlapping streams of las fire that stripped the void shields from the lead kill cruiser in 30 seconds. The Orc ship returned fire with cannons that fired shells the size of ground cars, one of which impacted the station's shield generator and shook the entire structure hard enough to knock equipment from workbenches in the Mechanicus research wing. The Orc ships launched boarding craft. Korath had 60 weapon servitors and 47 armed personnel. He had the station's internal weapon mounts, which were formidable. He had defensive lines prepared, overlapping fields of fire, covering every boarding access point, ammunition stocked, and weapons blessed, and servitors ordered to fight until physically incapable of doing so. He also had Saitama, who was standing in the corridor outside his quarters when the station alert klaxon sounded, asking whether this was the thing that was coming. "Not the main force," Korath said. "Advance elements. There will be more." "How many more?" "The Wa signature suggests millions." Saitama was quiet for a moment. "Millions," he said. "If Gorok's skull split is what the field signature implies, then yes." Saitama looked at the ceiling, which was shaking slightly as the station absorbed another impact. "Can I go outside?" Korath considered this. His threat models did not have a category for this kind of variable. "The boarding craft are attaching to the hull," he said. "If you go outside, you will encounter the boarding party." "Yes," Saitama said. There was a pause in which Korath ran the tactical calculation and arrived at the same conclusion via every analytical pathway available to him. "Airlock 7, he said. Saitama walked to Airlock 7. Korath followed, because his data collection instincts had overridden his self-preservation instincts entirely. He positioned himself at the inner airlock window and watched. The Orc boarding craft had attached to the hull via magnetic clamps and a crude but effective breach system, cutting through the outer hull plating with shaped charges and deploying a pressurized transit tube. Through his external sensors, Korath could see approximately 40 Orcs moving through the tube toward the hull breach, armed with a mixed collection of firearms and close combat weapons, their green skins lit by the amber glow of their own equipment lights. Saitama stepped out of Airlock 7 into the vacuum. He stood on the hull for a moment. The boarding tube was perhaps 40 meters away. The Orcs had not detected him yet, focused on the breach point, loudly discussing the impending violence in a language that Korath's translation systems rendered as mostly enthusiastic verb forms and very few nouns. Then one of them looked sideways and saw the man in the white suit standing on the hull, apparently waiting. The Orc made a sound. Saitama walked toward the boarding tube. The Orcs in the tube began firing through the hull breach, wild shots that went wide in the vacuum, las shots and slug rounds, and what appeared to be a guided rocket from a shoulder-mounted launcher. The rocket hit Saitama in the chest and exploded with sufficient force to crater the hull plating around him. Korath's sensors registered the impact. He then registered Saitama walking out of the smoke, brushing debris from his cape. The Orcs made more sounds. Saitama reached the boarding tube. He put his hand on the transit tube structure. He applied pressure. The boarding tube crumpled, not with the slow groaning failure of structural metal under stress. It crumpled the way paper crumpled in a fist, instantly and completely, the entire rigid structure compressing in a single motion. The 40 Orcs inside it were subjected to a G-force event that Korath's impact models classified as non-survivable at anything below maximum ceramite-reinforced armor tolerance, and these Orcs were wearing what the Mechanicus would charitably describe as no armor at all by any meaningful definition. The boarding tube fell off the hull and drifted away in the dark, silent. Saitama turned to the remaining 2 kill cruisers. One of them began attempting to initiate warp transit. A kill cruiser required approximately 12 minutes to spin up a warp drive from cold start. Saitama crossed 40 kilometers of void in a time that Korath's instruments measured, but that his cognition refused to accept as accurate. He hit the kill cruiser with a single strike. The ship did not break apart. It did not explode in the conventional sense. The hull ahead of the impact point compressed, and then the force transferred through the entire structure of the vessel, every internal bulkhead and frame member, and fuel line, and weapon mounting, absorbing the kinetic transfer simultaneously, and the kill cruiser simply came apart, not in an explosion, but in an expanding cloud of component pieces, evenly distributed, as though someone had removed every weld and bolt and seal at once. The third kill cruiser completed a partial warp transit and vanished, which was not supposed to be possible at 12 seconds into a spin-up, but which the pilot apparently felt was preferable to the alternative. Saitama floated in the debris field for a moment. He looked at his fist. He looked at the debris cloud where the kill cruiser had been. He looked at his fist again. What was on his face was not satisfaction. It was the same thing Korath had seen in him since the first day, a precise and specific hunger that had not been fed, a counting down towards something that kept not arriving. He came back through airlock 7 and took his cape off and put it over his arm. "More coming?" he said. "Yes," Korath said. He was still processing the instrument data. He would be processing it for some time, the main fleet much more. Saitama nodded. He sat down on a cargo crate in the corridor and waited. The Warg came out of warp transit over 12 hours, not all at once. The warp was not precise, and a fleet of 3,000 ships in varying states of maintenance and navigational competence did not arrive on a clean schedule. They came in surges and clusters, small groups emerging from the dimensional boundary and immediately beginning the process of locating the station, locating each other, and locating the nearest possible fight. Korath stood in the observation deck and watched the auger display fill with contacts. 20 contacts, became 100, became 500, became 1,000. The auger system was designed to track fleet-scale engagements. Its red contact markers had a finite number of display points at standard resolution. By the time the count reached 1,200, the display was beginning to populate areas with aggregate blobs rather than individual points, because the system did not have a category for this many simultaneous contacts. The Mechanicus personnel on the station were, by the cultural standards of their organization, extremely calm about most things. The data was the data. The data was frightening. They were calm about the data. Saitama came to the observation deck when the count hit 800 and stood there for a while, looking at the auger display. He could not read it in the conventional sense, but he understood what a lot of red contact markers meant. "All enemies?" he said. "All orcs," Korath confirmed. "Yes." Saitama looked at the display for a long time. "How long before they get here?" "At current approach speeds, the forward elements will be in weapons range in approximately 40 minutes. The main body will follow over several hours. The Warboss's command ship, which the field signature suggests is the largest vessel in the fleet, will likely not reach the station until the forward elements have established their engagement." "So I go out now," Saitama said, "and there will be more behind them." "Continuously," Korath said. "For several hours at minimum." Saitama nodded slowly. He looked at his hands. "Good," he said again. But this time, the word was different. It was not the quiet, restrained thing it had been before. This time, it had an edge. Not excitement, precisely, because excitement was too small a word for something this old and this banked. It was closer to recognition, the feeling of a word finally being matched to a thing that had been living nameless in the mind for years. "Here it is, finally. You will be in the engagement for the duration," Korath said. "I want to continue observation. You want to watch. I want to record every variable I can access." Saitama looked at him. The look was not unfriendly, but it was clear-eyed. The look of someone seeing exactly what the person in front of them is, and not requiring them to pretend otherwise. "You are going to learn something from this," Saitama said. "I hope so," Korath said. "I hope so too," Saitama said. He walked to the airlock and went out. The forward elements of the Warth, were a spread of smaller vessels, Orc fighter craft and bombers and boarding shuttles, moving in loose formations across the void between the main fleet and the station, a disorganized and aggressive approach that was effective in the same way that a thrown handful of rocks was effective, because there were very many of them. Korath counted 700 individual craft in the forward elements. His station defense batteries had begun firing, tracking what they could, which was a small fraction of the incoming wave. Saitama went out to meet them. There was a moment on the sensor feeds, before the engagement began, where Korath watched a single human-sized figure moving in the void toward a wave of 700 Orc craft, and the ratio between those two things was so extreme that for a fraction of a second his analytical systems generated a probability assessment that came out not as a survival chance, but as a margin of error artifact, a value so small that the display simply showed the symbol his systems used when a measurement exceeded the resolution of available instruments. Then Saitama hit the forward wave. The recordings that Korath assembled over the following hours would later consume 43 hours of his personal review time and result in a monograph that he would never transmit anywhere, but that he would reread 11 times in the last years of his life. They showed things that his instruments recorded correctly and that his analytical frameworks could not process without generating output errors, because the data violated assumptions built into the frameworks at the foundational level. A man moved through a formation of 700 vessels at speeds that made the vessels appear stationary in relation. Every contact with a vessel produced results consistent with the crumpling of the boarding tube, instantaneous, complete, non-gradual. The impulse of each strike distributed through structural members too quickly for the dispersion to be sequential, meaning the force was moving through target objects faster than sound could carry information about its presence, which was not possible within standard physical models. Orc fighters tried to fire on him. Most could not track him. The ones that registered his position fired and hit him. Multiple impacts registered against his person. The biomonitors did not change. The impact energy appeared to dissipate into his biological mass with no apparent effect. He simply kept moving. In 22 minutes, 700 Orc forward element craft had been reduced to debris fields. The debris fields were large, expanding clouds of structural metal and Orc biological material that drifted in a rough sphere centered on the station, a monument in components to what had just happened. The main fleet was still coming. Korath watched Saitama float in the debris and wait. The Orcs in the main fleet were watching too, through their crude optical systems and psychic field readings, and what Korath could measure through the Warg field was not quite fear, because Orcs did not feel fear in the conventional sense, but something else. A recalibration, a revision. The Warg field surged stronger, not weaker, because Orcs did not respond to a display of overwhelming power by retreating. They responded to a display of overwhelming power the way they responded to everything they found very impressive, which was by wanting it very badly and moving toward it with maximum velocity. The main fleet accelerated. The battle, if it could be called a battle when only one of the two parties was in any meaningful danger, went on for 6 hours. Korath catalogued every second. He had his full instrument array pointed outward, recording at maximum resolution, his acolytes stationed at every data terminal on the station, capturing and annotating and cross-referencing in real time, because this was the most important data collection event of his career, and possibly of the Mechanicus's entire documented history, and he was not going to let a single variable escape him. What he saw in those 6 hours changed his understanding of physical possibility. The Orc fleet came in waves, not by strategy, but by the natural progression of a fleet whose vessels moved at different speeds and whose commanders were focused primarily on getting to the target rather than coordinating their arrival. This meant that Saitama faced a continuous flow of enemies rather than a single massed engagement, which was, Korath observed with a growing sense of something he would later classify as philosophical unease, exactly the worst possible scenario for an ordinary combatant, and exactly the best possible scenario for a being who wanted an enemy that did not end. The first large warship to reach him was a battle cruiser, a vessel 3 kilometers long and packed with Orcs beyond what any rational loading calculation would permit. Its gunners fired every weapon they had. Saitama flew through the fire. He struck the prow. He struck the engine section. He came around the underside and struck the weapon batteries. The battle cruiser went dark and drifted. Another ship came. He dealt with it. Another, and the line of contacts on Korath's display continued to replenish because orcs that saw the battle from further back in the fleet did not wait their turn. They changed course and altered speed and jostled past each other to get to the front, and the result was a continuous stream of vessels arriving in the engagement zone, rather than a wave that could peak and exhaust. Korath watched something happen over the 3rd and 4th hours that he could not have anticipated. Saitama changed, not physically. His biometrics remained consistent. His physical capabilities appeared unchanged. What changed was harder to quantify, but Korath's long experience with observing systems told him it was real and significant. The man was fighting, and after years in which fighting had been an empty formality, fighting here was not empty. Not because these enemies could hurt him, they could not. Not because the challenge was sufficient to threaten him, it was not. But because no matter how many he destroyed, there were more coming, and the next one coming was the thing his biology had been waiting for since the day he punched through his last real enemy on his own world, and felt the satisfaction drain out of everything. The next one is always coming. He moved through the Warg fleet with a speed the Orc pilots could not track, and a force their hulls could not absorb, and he kept moving, and they kept coming, and neither side ran out of what they were bringing to the engagement. In the 5th hour, Saitama flew directly into the interior of a hangar bay on a mid-sized warship. He was immediately surrounded by 500 orcs who had been waiting for their boarding craft to launch. The hangar bay was cramped and loud and lit by the orange glow of orc energy systems, and 500 greenskins in combat gear launched themselves at him simultaneously. Korath could not see this on external sensors. He had to infer it from subsequent events, which included the warship's structural monitoring systems generating 47 simultaneous hull breach warnings in the space of 90 seconds, all of them internal, centered on the hangar bay, spreading outward as though something inside the ship was very quickly making the ship not a ship anymore. Saitama came out through what had been the bridge, covered in orc grease and metal filings. He shook it off his cape and continued. The Warg field was at maximum. Korath's instruments had never registered a field this intense. 3 million orcs feeling simultaneously that the best fight in the history of their species was happening right there. The 200,000 in the immediate fleet who could get there were trying to. There was something in the field, Korath noticed in the 6th hour, that was distinct from the general energetic noise, directed, purposeful, moving differently. He ran the analysis. The warboss's ship was coming. Gorok's Skullsplit had watched 6 hours of his fleet being destroyed by a single figure, and his War field signal was not despair, and it was not retreat. It was exactly what Korath had understood from the beginning, translated from the psychic language of a species made entirely for violence into the analytical language of a mind built entirely for data. I want that. The command ship was a vessel of absurd proportions even by Warg standards. Gorok had been adding to it for 32 years, welding captured hulls onto the exterior, mounting weapons of every captured type, expanding the internal volume to accommodate the ever-growing collection of orcs who wanted to be close to the warboss, who kept finding the good fights. It was not a ship anymore in the engineering sense. It was a city that happened to be in space, a floating monument to 32 years of accumulated violence, and it was moving through the debris field of its own destroyed fleet, with the authority of something that has never encountered a reason to slow down. It was going to reach the station in 40 minutes. Korath opened the external vox. Saitama, he said. There was a pause. Yes, came the reply, distorted by distance and the still firing weapons of 3 separate vessels that Saitama was apparently dealing with simultaneously. The warboss is coming, Korath said. The one who leads them all. He is approximately 40 minutes out. The rest of the fleet will follow him. How big is he? Korath had the measurements from the sensor feed. Large, he said. For an orc, exceptionally large. He has been growing his Warg for 32 years, which means he has had 32 years of battle energy to convert into physical scale. There was a pause in which the external sensors registered 2 simultaneous hull breach events on different vessels and then silence. And after him, Saitama said. More. 3 million orcs total. Approximately 180,000 are now committed to this engagement. Another pause. Okay, Saitama said. Is there anything you need? Any support the station can provide. There was a long silence. No, Saitama said. I need to think for a minute. Korath watched his biometrics, heart rate dropping. The physiological signature of a human being settling into deliberate calm. He was not afraid. Korath had spent enough time studying him to recognize what fear would look like in his readings. This was not fear. It was the opposite. It was preparation of a specific and old kind. The preparation of someone who has waited long enough and is allowing themselves to want what they have been waiting for. The command ship emerged from the debris field like a continent. No other word fit. It was not a vessel in the way that a vessel implied designed purpose and measured engineering. It was an accumulation, a 32-year sediment of violence made three-dimensional, every surface covered in weapons and armor plates and banners, and the skulls of things that had been strong and were now decorations. Its profile had no clean lines. It had no bilateral symmetry. It simply occupied space with the authority of a natural feature, the way a mountain occupied space, by being too much to argue with. On its bridge, Gorok Skullsplit had watched 6 hours of his fleet being reduced to expanding debris clouds. He had watched with the expression of someone watching something they had been waiting their whole life to see, and discovering it is even better than they imagined. His knobs had been reporting the loss count, and he had waved them quiet after the first hour. Loss count was irrelevant. What was relevant was the figure they kept showing him on the visual feed, the man in the white suit and the yellow cape, moving through the fleet like something the universe had quietly decided to deploy against everything that moved. Gorok had 15 meters of armor plating over his personal bridge viewport. He put his fist through it. He could see better without it. The figure was visible now, drifting in the debris field ahead, and Gorok could feel it through the Wag field, in a way his instruments could not have conveyed. The psychic impression was not powerful in the warp sense. The man had no warp presence at all. What Gorok felt was something else, something older and more physical, the recognition of something that could push back. He stepped off the bridge and walked to the hull access. He did not take his knobs. He did not take escort. He had fought alone before, at the beginning, when there were 50 orcs, and no fleet, and no legend, and just him and whatever enemy he could find. This felt like that. Gorok Skullsplit stepped out onto the hull of his command ship in the void and stood and looked across the debris field. Saitama was looking back at him, 30 kilometers of empty space between them, the dead stars of the Harroglass cluster cold behind them both. The debris of 6 hours of engagement drifting between them in slow expanding clouds, the metal and materials of 2,000 ships reduced to monument. Saitama flew toward him. He crossed 30 kilometers in a time that Korath would later calculate and refuse to share with any of his acolytes. He arrived in front of the war boss and stopped and looked up. Gorok Skullsplit was large. Even by the scale Saitama had developed a reference point for over the past hours, by the ships and the hangar bays and the orc bodies, even relative to those things, Gorok Skullsplit was large. 5 meters of reinforced orc flesh, muscle mass accumulated over 32 years of combat-nourished growth, bone plates bolted over bone plates, fists the size of engine housings. He looked down at Saitama and bared every tooth he had. Saitama looked up at him. "You," Gorok said, and the word carried across the vacuum through the Wag field, rather than through any physical medium, a psychic transmission of pure intent that Korath's instruments translated roughly as a declaration of personal recognition combined with a territorial challenge and a claim of ownership over whatever was about to happen. "Me," Saitama said. Gorok hit him. The fist that descended was not a precise strike. Gorok Skullsplit had not survived 32 years of galactic-scale combat through precision. He had survived through the simple and overwhelming reality that everything he hit experienced more force than it could absorb. His strike connected with Saitama with a sound that Korath's external senses registered as a shockwave expanding outward through the local space, displacing the debris field in a perfect sphere centered on the impact point. Saitama took the hit. He was pushed back. Not far, not in a way that looked like damage, but he was pushed back, and Korath's biomonitors registered a spike in his readings that had not appeared during 6 hours of war. Fleet engagement, a spike in the specific band that Korath had been trying to characterize since day one. Saitama stopped moving backward. He looked at his chest. There was a dent in the bodysuit over his sternum, a compression of fabric, and the suggestion of pressure applied, something that his body had absorbed. He looked at Gorok, and something happened to his face. Korath saw it on the sensor feed. He had studied that face for days, catalogued its limited register of expressions, built a predictive model for what different readings corresponded to. None of his models had this expression in their training data. It was not quite a smile. It was something older than a smile, something that had been in storage a very long time and was now out in the open air. Saitama hit back. He did not hit at maximum output. Korath's instruments told him this much because the instruments told him what had happened to every other thing Saitama had struck at maximum output, and those things were now debris. Gorok's skull split was not debris. The blow connected, and the warboss went back, across the void, crashing through the outer armor plating of his own command ship with a sound like a landslide, and the command ship's outer hull showed a circular impact crater where his body had transited through it. The ship shook. Its structural integrity monitors sang alerts across its entire length. Gorok's skull split pushed through the wreckage and came back out. He was bleeding from 3 places. His left armored plate had been sheared from its bolt points. His grin was wider than his face looked designed to accommodate. He charged across the void. What followed was what Korath would spend the rest of his career attempting to describe, and never once feel he had described adequately. The two combatants crossed the void between the station and the command ship in a trajectory that demolished pieces of both on every pass. Gorok hit Saitama 14 more times over the course of the engagement, and on every hit Korath's biomonitors registered impact absorption at a level that told him something very important, which was that Gorok's strikes had done nothing meaningful and that Saitama had let them connect. Every single time. He had been fast enough to avoid every strike the fleet had thrown at him. He had moved through incoming fire without being touched for 6 hours. He was not moving that way now. He was standing in Gorok's strikes and letting them land, and his face wore the expression that had come out of storage, and it was not self-destruction. It was something that Korath, who was not a warrior, needed time to understand. Saitama was feeling the fight. For 32 punches that landed on the warboss's hull-reinforced body, Gorok's skull split battered Saitama, and Saitama battered him back, and the exchange was not equal. It was never equal because the warboss was healing faster than he was accumulating damage, and Saitama was not accumulating any damage at all. But the exchange had a quality that nothing in the war fleet engagement had had. It had weight, not because the warboss was threatening him, but because the warboss was real, and the fight between them had a reality that the previous 6 hours had approached but never quite achieved, because the previous 6 hours had been Saitama performing an action on objects, and this was Saitama engaged in combat with a being that had also decided this was important. The war field around them was at a magnitude that Korath's instruments were no longer able to process without generating hardware errors. 3 million orcs feeling simultaneously what was happening between their warboss and the small figure in the white suit. 3 million orcs feeling it and it not being what they expected, because their warboss was not winning, and the small figure was not running, and what was happening between them was something that even an orc could recognize as unusual. Gorok's skull split charged for the 33rd time. Saitama watched him come. He thought about 6 hours of fleet. He thought about the forward wave, 700 craft, taken apart in 22 minutes. He thought about the hangar bay and the 500 orcs in the tight dark space. He thought about this fight, 32 exchanges, and the weight of each one. He thought about what was on the other side of this moment. One punch. He pulled his right fist back. Gorok's skull split saw it coming and did not stop. Because he was Gorok's skull split, and he had been looking for the thing that would push him to his own edge for 32 years, and he had found it in a yellow-caped human who did not understand the galaxy he had fallen into, and he was absolutely not going to flinch at the thing he had been looking for. Saitama's fist moved. Not casually, not gently, not in the way the fleet engagements had moved, efficient and remote. This was deliberate and full, and aimed at something real. The impact was not loud. Impact at that velocity created a pressure event that propagated outward from the point of contact, and then everything else was secondary. The secondary effects were loud. The impact itself was a silence, the silence of a force too large for the medium it was traveling through. Gorok's skull split traveled backward through 18 kilometers of void and impacted his own command ship amidships, and the command ship came apart at the seams, not from the impact, not from the warboss's body passing through it, but from the shockwave of displaced space that arrived a fraction of a second after, the ripple of a punch that had moved faster than the local fabric of space had time to adjust for. The command ship became debris. The Warga field went quiet, not silent, not dead, but quiet, in the way that a crowd goes quiet when something happens that redefines the scale of the event. 3 million orcs processing simultaneously. The flagship was gone. The warboss was gone. The thing they had all moved toward, the great promise of the perfect fight, had ended. Saitama floated in the debris field. He looked at his fist. He put it down. The remaining orc fleet did not leave quickly, because orcs did not process the concept of retreat quickly, and also because a significant portion of them were not yet certain what had happened. But over the 6 hours following the warboss's death, the War field collapsed in the way that all Wars eventually collapsed when the central energy source was removed. The shared psychic excitement diminished, the directional pull dissipated, and individual orc commanders rediscovered the ability to make their own decisions, the most popular of which turned out to be finding somewhere else to be. By the time the Imperial Response Fleet arrived, 41 hours after Korath's original tight beam, the Orc fleet was a dispersed mass of individual vessels moving in 16 different directions with no coordinated purpose. The Mechanicus Forge world had sent a strike cruiser and 2 destroyer escorts. They found the engagement zone, and found the debris field, and found the intact, undamaged transit station in the middle of it all, and the captain of the strike cruiser sent a Vox request for a status report that Korath took 11 minutes to compose because he was not certain how to condense the relevant data. He settled on the essential facts. War of significant scale engaged at this location. War broken. Transit station uncompromised. No casualties among station personnel. The anomalous individual who had engaged the War fleet remained at the station and was cooperating with observation protocols. The captain of the strike cruiser took some time to respond. When she did, she asked Korath to repeat the casualty count. Korath repeated it. She asked for clarification on the phrase, anomalous individual. Korath considered how to frame this accurately. He sent the first 30 minutes of sensor recordings from the engagement and said, "This individual is the reason the casualty count is what it is." There was a longer pause. Then the strike cruiser requested permission to dock. Saitama was in the commissary when the strike cruiser captain came aboard, eating again, his white suit cleaned, and his cape folded over the back of the chair. He looked up when the captain entered. Captain Sarah Mavaris of the Mechanicus strike cruiser Unyielding Calculation was a compact woman in Forge World fatigues, her left arm a standard Mechanicus augment, her right eye replaced with an augmetic monocle. She had commanded a strike cruiser for 12 years, and she had, by her own count, never been surprised. She was surprised now. She looked at the man in the white suit, eating rations in the commissary of a transit station in the middle of a debris field that had, according to the sensor data, been a 3,000-ship Orc fleet 41 hours ago. "You did this," she said. "Yes," Saitama said. "All of it." "Yes." She sat down across from him. Korath stood in the doorway and said nothing, because this was the kind of conversation that produced more data when the collector was quiet. "Why?" Mavaris said. Saitama considered. "The Magos said they were coming, and they sounded large," he said. "I asked if I should go out, and he did not say no." Mavaris looked at Korath. Korath nodded confirmation. She looked back at Saitama. "You are not from this galaxy," she said. "Not a question." "Different universe," he said. She processed this. "The Mechanicus will want you," she said. Not diplomatically, not softened, just the fact. The Inquisition will want you. The Astartes will want you. Everyone is going to want you for something. I know, Saitama said. Does that bother you? He thought about it, genuinely, without hurry. Not really, he said. I do not need much. A place to sleep, food. He paused. And enemies. Myvaris looked at him for a long moment. In this galaxy, she said, that last part is not going to be a problem. Saitama nodded. He finished his rations. He set the tray aside. The big one, he said. Goruk. He was the best fight I have had in years. The sentence landed in the commissary with a weight that Captain Myvaris felt in her chest. He is dead, she said. Yes, Saitama said. He looked at his hands. That is the problem. The problem was not remorse. Korath had run enough bio readings to know the difference. What Saitama was looking at, in the fact of his hands, was the same problem he had arrived with. The problem that had preceded him across universes. The problem that an enemy the size of a warg had temporarily solved and permanently restated. He had found something worth fighting, and he had ended it. And now he was back here, in the commissary, with his hands, and the problem was still the same. Korath spent 3 days with Saitama after the Mechanicus strike cruiser arrived. He spent them the way he had spent every day since the man knocked on his hull, asking questions and running instruments, and trying to understand the thing he was looking at. He shared his findings, all of them, with Saitama. He showed him the output models, the projection curves, the statistical improbability of every bio reading, the instruments that generated error codes because they lacked the architecture to hold what they were measuring. He showed Saitama himself in numbers that no biological should have been able to produce, and he watched Saitama look at the numbers with the same expression he brought to everything, mild, a little tired. You still want to know why, Saitama said. Every measurement implies a function, Korath said. The Omnissiah does not produce phenomena without purpose. And you think my purpose is what? Korath had thought about this. He had thought about it continuously since day one, and he had arrived at no satisfying answer, which was unusual for him, and which he had come to suspect might be the answer itself. I think, he said slowly, that your purpose may not be the kind that fits a measurement framework, and I think that is perhaps the most important thing I have ever catalogued. Saitama looked at him. Something shifted in his face, faint, the micro-expression Korath had learned to watch for when something genuinely registered. In my universe, Saitama said, I wanted to be a hero, not to be powerful, to be a hero, and I got powerful on the way and stopped being able to find things worth being a hero against. And here, Korath said, Saitama looked out the viewport at the debris field. It was still there, would be there for months, while the slow gravity of the dead stars redistributed it. The monument of 2,000 ships and 3 million orcs, and 32 years of war. Here there are always things worth being a hero against, he said. Yes, Korath said. That war boss, Saitama said. He was looking for what I was looking for. I believe so. He deserved a longer fight. Korath considered this. In the theology of the Omnissiah, in the doctrine of the ecclesiarchy, in the warrior traditions of the Astartes, there was no framework for grieving a worthy enemy. The enemy was the enemy. Victory was the purpose. In this galaxy, Korath said, you will find others like him. How many? More than you could count in a lifetime. Saitama nodded. He sat with this for a moment, and Korath sat with it too, in his wheeled chassis in the observation deck, with the debris field beyond them, and the cold dead stars providing their insufficient light. Then I will stay, Saitama said. He said it the way he said most things, without drama, without ceremony. The way a person says a thing they have already decided. Korath composed the message to the Forge world. He composed it carefully, and this time he included everything. The output readings, the engagement records, the 32 years of war, broken in 41 hours by a single biological individual, the biomonitors, the conversations in the vacuum, the 3 days of observation. He included a recommendation that the information be shared with the relevant imperial authorities. He also composed a notation for his personal files, which no one else would ever read, in the careful and precise language of a man who had spent 60 years cataloging things that refused to follow the rules. Anomaly class, unclassifiable. Output, unbounded. Origin, undetermined. Threat assessment, not applicable in conventional sense. He paused over the last field, the one labeled function. He thought about the equation he had written as a young acolyte. All things that exist, exist for a function. He thought about a man sitting on the hull of a void station in the vacuum every night, looking at stars that had nothing to offer him, waiting for an enemy that never came, and then finding one that kept coming for 6 hours, and the expression that appeared on his face when Goruk Skullsplit's first punch landed. He filled in the field. Function, to fight what cannot be ended, to stand between what is and what should not be. Not because the mathematics demand it, but because he cannot do otherwise. He locked the file. Outside the viewport, Saitama had returned to the hull. He was standing there again, as he did every evening, looking at the stars. But tonight, it was different. Tonight the stars were not empty. The debris field was between him and them, and the debris field was the evidence of the thing that had been there and was no longer there, and the space where it had been was not empty in the way the stars were empty. He had put something into the darkness. And the darkness in the 41st millennium was very large, and very old, and very full of things that had not yet been put there. In the segmentum obscurus, in the warp-fractured passages between dead stars, word began to move through channels both technological and psychic, in tight beam transmissions and astropathic whispers, and the biological communications of species that used no instruments at all. A new figure had appeared at Castrum Viridis, a figure without a name in any tongue the 41st millennium recognized. A figure that had stood in the vacuum and waited for the largest Wa in the sector's recent history to arrive, and then had simply resolved it. No army, no fleet, no armor, no augmentation. A white suit and a yellow cape, and fists that moved in a way that instruments recorded but could not make sense of. The Inquisition logged the transmission with a case number. The Mechanicus forwarded the data with 11 separate flagged annotations. A rogue trader in a void station bar in the Segmentum Solar heard a second-hand version and added it to the collection of stories he told about places he had been near but not quite at. A sister of battle on pilgrimage received the astropathic whisper and spent 3 days in prayer, trying to determine whether what she was hearing was a miracle or a warning. On a dozen orc worlds, the remnants of the Wa that had not been there but had felt the field collapse from 100 systems away sat with the sensation and turned it over in their minds, the way orcs turn things over, slowly, with their whole body, until they found the angle that made sense. The angle they found was simple. There was something out there that was the best fight, better than Goruk, better than everything, something that even Goruk had found and lost. And the place it was found was a transit station in the Harroglass cluster, and the field echo of it was still there, faint and directional, like an ember after a fire. They began to move. They did not know what they were moving toward. They knew it was the best fight, and in the cold void between dead stars, the figure in the white suit and the yellow cape stood on the hull of a transit station and looked at the dark and felt, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, that the dark was looking back. The 41st millennium had found its most improbable champion, a man who asked nothing of the universe except that it keep sending enemies he had not yet finished. The universe, in its grim and merciless generosity, had never once failed to provide.